History remembers him as a joke, the little man in a greatcoat supposedly too small to command respect. Yet Napoleon Bonaparte, the so-called shortest general, was measured at average height for his age. The myth began with a clerical slip and was sharpened by enemy ridicule. That error fueled a wave of mockery in the press and among rival commanders who dismissed him as insignificant, but that misunderstanding became his secret weapon. The world laughed until he overturned everything they thought they knew about power. No one was laughing when it was too late to stop him. How did ridicule become the mask behind which he built an unstoppable machine? And what does it really cost to mistake an invention of propaganda for weakness? Napoleon's height was never a mystery to those who measured him. Measured carefully, recorded plainly, written down. In 1821, on the island of St. Helena, his physician Francesco Antomarchi recorded the number 5 pies, 2 pouces. That was the standard French system, 1 pied measuring 32.48 centimeters, each pouce just over 2.7 centimeters. The math is simple, but the consequences were not. 5 pied equals 162.4 centimeters. 2 pouces adds 5.42 more for a total of 167.8 centimeters. In modern terms, that is just under 5 feet 6 inches. For early 19th century France, this was entirely unremarkable, a touch taller than the average man of his generation. But the measurement did not stay in French. When British translators encountered the record, they read 5 feet 2 inches, as if it were their own units, not realizing the French inch was longer. The error shaved nearly 10 centimeters off his stature. Suddenly, the general who stood eye to eye with his officers became, on paper, a figure barely reaching the shoulder of his guards. The myth was born, not in the field, but in the conversion table. The autopsy at St. Helena, witnessed by British and French doctors alike, confirmed the same figure. No one present described a tiny man. Yet the number, mistranslated and uncorrected, spread quickly. It was a clerical mistake, a slip of arithmetic, but it would echo far louder than any cannon. Napoleon's arrival in France did not erase the sound of Corsican in his voice. His accent, thick and unmistakable, followed him from Ajacio's narrow streets into the halls of the French military. Letters from Parisian elites and senior officers recorded their impressions, calling him that Corsican upstart or the little general with the foreign tongue. At court, his origins set him apart from men who traced their bloodlines back centuries. In the barracks, though, his difference became something else entirely. Among the rank and file, Napoleon's willingness to wade into mud and gunpowder to share bread and risk earned him an affectionate nickname, Le Petit Caporal. It meant more than size. To his soldiers, it was a mark of approachability, a sign that he was one of their own, not a distant aristocrat. The name began around the Italian campaigns, when men watched him direct artillery by hand, sleeves rolled up, boots caked in the same dirt as theirs. Contemporary memoirs recall the phrase spreading through the ranks, a mixture of respect and camaraderie. But outside the army, in salons and newspapers, the nickname lost its warmth. For those who already saw Napoleon as an outsider, Petit was stripped of affection and loaded with scorn. His stature, his birthplace, even his manner of speaking, all became easy targets for ridicule. The stage was set. A leader marked by difference, underestimated not just for his height, but for the accident of his birth and the cadence of his words. On a winter morning in 1803, a new print appeared in the window of Hannah Humphrey's shop on St. James's Street. The artist was James Gillray, already notorious for biting satire. This time, his target was a figure known across Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte. The caricature, titled Maniac Ravings, or Little Boney in a strong fit, showed the French leader stomping and raging, his body shrunken beneath an outsized bicorn hat. The proportions were no accident. Gilray's Napoleon was not just furious. He was laughably small, a figure of ridicule rather than fear. The plate was etched and hand-colored, then pressed onto paper in runs that sometimes reached into the thousands. Humphrey's shop became a magnet for crowds. Londoners gathered at her window, jostling for a glimpse, sometimes brawling for position. The prints were sold for a shilling or two, affordable to clerks and tradesmen as well as the city's elite. Copies traveled by post and by hand, carried to coffee houses, reading rooms, and private parlors. Imitators followed quickly, artists like Cruikshank and Rowlandson, each repeating the theme of the tiny Corsican. Within months, Little Boney had become a fixture in the British imagination. The prints did not stay in London. Merchants and emigres smuggled them to the continent, where they surfaced in Amsterdam, Vienna, and even Paris. The motifs repeated: the ill-fitting uniform, the comically large hat, the suggestion of impotence and overreach. Newspapers picked up the images, reprinting them as woodcuts or describing them in columns. The scale of the operation is hard to measure, but contemporary diaries describe the phenomenon as a kind of mania, thousands of impressions and tens of thousands of eyes. The caricature was not just a joke, it was a tool, saturating the public mind with a single, vivid idea. Napoleon was not to be feared, he was to be mocked. The myth, once seeded by a measurement error, now bloomed in the open, reinforced by every shop window and every laugh in the street. Across the Rhine and into the heart of Central Europe, the image of Napoleon as a figure to be mocked seeped from cartoons into the highest levels of military planning. In Vienna, General Karl Mack wrote to his superiors from Ulm in 1805, dismissing the French leader as an insignificant upstart, convinced that such a man could not possibly threaten the seasoned armies of Austria. Mack's correspondence, preserved in Bavarian archives, betrays a confidence that would soon prove disastrous. He delayed maneuvers, hesitated to break out, and treated French advances as little more than a nuisance. The word insignificant was not chosen lightly. It reflected a view that the man behind the French army was unworthy of real fear. The Prussian staff, watching events unfold from Berlin, echoed this contempt in their own memoranda. The Duke of Brunswick, presiding over councils before Jena, referred to Napoleon as this Corsican adventurer, a phrase that stripped him of legitimacy and reduced his threat to that of a passing storm. Prussian war plans described the French as a disorganized mass led by a jumped-up general, not a rival worthy of the old dynasty's respect. Officers debated tactics with an air of condescension, assuming that discipline and tradition would be enough to scatter the enemy. Russian diaries from Kutuzov's staff in 1805 called Napoleon a petty adventurer, a man whose ambitions were seen as laughable rather than alarming. Coalition leaders reading British cartoons and exchanging stories allowed ridicule to color judgment. The effect was not just cultural but operational. Orders were delayed, forces dispersed, negotiations drawn out, all under the belief that the so-called little general posed little danger. In this atmosphere of contempt, the foundations were laid for surprise and disaster on the battlefield. The myth of smallness was no longer just a joke. It had become a guiding principle for strategy. The Grande Armée did not move like its rivals. In the autumn of 1805, as Austrian and Russian columns waited for orders that crawled across muddy roads, Napoleon's corps covered 20 to 30 kilometers a day, each acting on its own instructions. The difference was not cosmetic, it was differently organized in almost every respect. The corps system, formalized in the lead-up to the Ulm campaign, divided his army into semi-independent groups. Infantry, cavalry, artillery, and supply each traveled with their own staff, logistics, and field command. Each corps could act alone, yet still fit into a larger plan. That built-in autonomy rewired how the French moved and fought. Orders from headquarters were precise and brief, often no more than a single page, copied by hand and sent to multiple columns at once. Surviving staff records from the Vincennes archive show the language. Marshal Ney, advance at dawn. Marshal Lannes, form the left. Supplies to follow at noon. That clarity and brevity let separate corps march on parallel roads and converge at a chosen point with very little warning. This structure was new to continental warfare. Traditional armies relied on massive, centralized formations that lumbered forward at a single pace while couriers carried every decision. Napoleon's corps could march separately, forage locally, and then support each other in battle or in retreat. The staff system, led by figures like Berthier, tracked each unit's position day by day and updated routes as new intelligence arrived. The effect was not just speed, but unpredictability. Coalition generals used to days of warning found French forces appearing on flanks or in the rear with almost no notice. Captured staff orders from the Ulm campaign show how precise timing and distance calculations allowed 6 separate corps to encircle Mack's army in less than a week. A Prussian observer remarked that the French move as if by telegraph. It was this organizational edge, quiet and methodical and almost bureaucratic in its efficiency, that turned underestimation into disaster for Napoleon's enemies. The myth of disarray, of a rabble led by novelty, collapsed under the converging columns and the relentless work of the staff. Napoleon understood that the way he was seen could be as powerful as any maneuver on the battlefield. In 1801, he summoned Jacques-Louis David, the leading painter of the era, with a specific instruction. The artist later recalled the words, "Render me not as I am, but as I must be seen." The result was the now iconic portrait, Napoleon crossing the Alps. The image did not show a man of average build tired from campaign roads. Instead, it presented a figure larger than life, calm atop a rearing stallion, cloak billowing, hand raised as if commanding history itself. No hint of hesitation, no trace of the outsider's accent or the soldier's mud, only the certainty of command. This was no accident. Napoleon's bulletins, distributed to the army and reprinted in Paris, described victories in terms that blurred the line between fact and legend. Reports from the field omitted mention of setbacks and painted each advance as inevitable. The language was carefully chosen, never "I ordered," but the army moved, as if the nation itself marched behind him. Medals and coins bore his profile, always in heroic relief, never full length beside the towering guards who might have spoiled the effect. Even in the staging of public ceremonies, he placed himself at the center, flanked by the tallest grenadiers, reinforcing the illusion of image. This careful construction of image did more than satisfy pride. It created a feedback loop. The more his enemies mocked him as Little Boney, the more his own propaganda pushed back with images of grandeur. Each caricature in London or Vienna was met with a new portrait or proclamation in Paris. The result was confusion on the battlefield. Commanders who expected a joke encountered a machine. Soldiers who had seen only ridicule in the papers found themselves facing a leader who seemed, in every official image, to embody the spirit of France itself. The myth was not just endured, it was managed, redirected, and at times wielded as a weapon. By the summer of 1812, the Grande Armée stretched from the Niemen River to the gates of Moscow. The line measured more than 1,000 kilometers. On paper, the numbers were immense, over 600,000 men at the outset, drawn from every corner of Napoleon's empire. But as the columns pushed further, their lifelines grew thin. Daily supply requirements for food, fodder, and ammunition multiplied with each league. French quartermasters calculated that each soldier needed at least a pound of bread per day and each horse 10 pounds of oats. The wagons lagged behind, mired in rutted roads and summer dust. Russian scorched earth tactics left little for foraging. Letters from the logistics staff in the Vincennes archives describe desperate measures, baking flour into hard biscuits, slaughtering draft animals, scraping the bottom of every barrel. By October, the army's numbers had begun to collapse. Disease, hunger, and desertion took a silent toll even before the first snows. Muster rolls from September show entire regiments reduced by half, with some units reporting fewer than 200 men where once there had been 1,000. By the onset of winter, estimates put losses at up to 500,000, nearly 4 out of every 5 who had crossed the Niemen. The scale of attrition outpaced anything the French staff had faced before. Couriers sent to Paris reported missing convoys, vanished depots, and horses dying faster than they could be replaced. The corps system, which once allowed independent action and rapid movement, now struggled to keep men fed and supplied across vast, empty distances. The machinery of Napoleon's military innovation had run up against the raw geography of Russia. What began as a campaign of speed and surprise became a test of endurance, with every kilometer gained paid for in blood and bone. The very system that once turned underestimation into victory was now stretched to its breaking point. In the aftermath of the Russian campaign, Europe's monarchs and ministers gathered in shadowed council rooms, studying the lessons of their own defeat. Gone was the easy laughter and dismissive talk of the little Corsican. Reports from the front now spoke in measured tones about French staff work, the corps system, and the reach of Napoleon's armies. For the first time, coalition leaders began to treat him not as an anomaly, but as a problem to be solved collectively. In 1813, this new realism took shape as the Treckenberg Plan. Prussia, Russia, and Austria agreed on a single doctrine: avoid direct battle with Napoleon himself. Instead, their armies would maneuver on separate fronts, targeting his marshals and stretching his supply lines. The plan called for coordinated movements by multiple national armies, each acting independently but always in communication, always refusing the decisive engagement Napoleon sought. By refusing to play to his strengths, the coalition aimed to wear him down through attrition and exhaustion. Dispatches from the Allied headquarters reveal a striking change in tone. Orders stressed patience, caution, and the need for constant intelligence sharing. Instead of rushing for glory, commanders now measured progress in days gained, not ground taken. The myth that once blinded Europe had lost its power. The coalition's leaders, long divided by suspicion and pride, now found unity in their determination to outlast the man they had once mocked. The surprise was gone. In its place stood calculation, discipline, and a shared understanding that the old rules no longer applied. Today, caricature still shapes reputations faster than evidence. While Napoleon's true height is settled in the archives, the myth endures, fueling how we judge rivals, leaders, and even threats. In every era, what we mock becomes what we ignore. And history shows the smallest mistake in perception often opens the door to the greatest surprise. What myths still blind us now?